The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 16-year-old Maria Santos turned her face toward the sound of Steve Harvey's voice with the kind of focused attention that comes from a lifetime of experiencing the world through sound, touch, and intuition rather than sight. When Steve asked about things you wish you could see, Maria's response, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate darkness with grace, made the entire Family Feud studio pause and reconsider everything they thought they knew about seeing. "My mother's face when she smiles," Maria had said simply, her voice carrying the weight of 16 years of wondering what the most important person in her world actually looked like. Maria Santos had been born completely blind, her world shaped not by colors and images, but by the symphony of sounds, the texture of touch, and the emotional landscape of voices that most people take for granted. She had never seen a sunset, never watched her own reflection in a mirror, never experienced the visual beauty that others described, but could never quite translate into her language of understanding. Yet Maria possessed a kind of sight that went far deeper than what eyes could offer, an ability to perceive truth, emotion, and character in ways that often escaped those who relied too heavily on visual appearance. The Santos family had traveled from San Antonio, Texas to Los Angeles for their Family Feud appearance, a journey that required careful planning and preparation to accommodate Maria's needs while ensuring she could participate fully in the experience. Maria's mother, Carmen Santos, had spent weeks describing the studio layout, the family podium setup, and the general atmosphere of the show so that Maria would feel confident and comfortable in the unfamiliar environment. Maria's understanding of Family Feud had been cultivated through years of dedicated listening, developing an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the show's patterns and rhythms. She could predict Steve Harvey's responses to certain types of answers, had memorized the sound effects that accompanied different moments in the game, and had even learned to anticipate commercial breaks by listening to subtle changes in the studio's energy and background noise. Family Feud had always been Maria's favorite show, not because she could see what was happening on screen, but because she could hear everything that mattered. She had memorized Steve Harvey's voice patterns, could identify different family members by their speech rhythms and emotional undertones, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict answers based on the subtle vocal cues that revealed people's true thoughts and feelings. Maria's blindness had been diagnosed shortly after birth, the result of a genetic condition that had left her optic nerves completely underdeveloped. There was no possibility of surgical correction, no hope for partial sight recovery, no medical intervention that could give her the visual world that others experienced. From her earliest days, Carmen Santos had made the decision to raise Maria as if her blindness was simply another characteristic, like having brown hair or being tall, rather than treating it as a limitation or tragedy. The family had learned Braille together, had filled their home with audiobooks and music, had traveled extensively so that Maria could experience different environments through sound and touch. Carmen had spent countless hours describing visual beauty to her daughter, the way sunlight looked when it streamed through windows, how colors appeared and changed, what people's faces revealed about their emotions and personalities. But despite these detailed descriptions, Maria had always wondered what her mother's smile actually looked like, what visual joy appeared like on the face of the person she loved most in the world. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Maria's idea, born from her desire to experience the show she loved from the inside, rather than just as a listener. She had convinced her family that her blindness wouldn't prevent her from participating fully, that her knowledge of the show and her ability to understand people through their voices would make her a valuable team member. The producers had been initially uncertain about accommodating a contestant with significant visual impairment, but Maria's confidence and enthusiasm had convinced them to give the family a chance. During the pre-show preparations, Maria had impressed everyone with her poise and preparation. She had memorized the studio layout after a detailed tour, had practiced using the buzzer system, and had demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify people by their voices and walking patterns. The production team had made minimal accommodations, ensuring that Maria knew exactly where to stand, providing verbal cues for timing, and making sure that microphones captured her responses clearly. The game had been proceeding wonderfully. The Santos family was competing against the Johnson family from Atlanta, and both sides had been playing with enthusiasm and good humor. Maria's father had provided excellent answers about household management. Her older brother had contributed knowledge about sports and entertainment, and her younger sister had shown her expertise in teenage culture. Maria had been positioned at the center of the family podium, where she could hear all the action and contribute when she felt confident about an answer. What had impressed everyone in the studio was Maria's obvious enjoyment of the experience. She laughed at Steve's jokes with genuine delight, cheered enthusiastically for her family's correct answers, and participated in the energy of the game with the kind of infectious joy that made everyone around her smile. Her blindness hadn't diminished her ability to be fully present and engaged. If anything, it had heightened her awareness of the emotional currents flowing through the studio. During the earlier rounds, Maria had already demonstrated her remarkable ability to read situations through sound alone. When a contestant from the opposing team had given a nervous answer, Maria had whispered to her brother that the person was anxious even before Steve had responded with encouragement. When the audience had laughed at a particularly funny response, Maria had accurately predicted that Steve would build on the humor with one of his signature comments. But when it came time for the category Things You Wish You Could See, and it was Maria's turn at the buzzer, the question struck at the heart of her deepest longing. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Maria's stillness had made him pause and soften his tone. "All right, Maria," Steve had said gently, positioning himself directly in front of her so his voice would be clear and easy to follow. "Things you wish you could see. What comes to mind?" Maria had tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was considering something important, her unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of Steve's voice with complete attention. "My mother's face when she smiles," Maria had said, her voice clear and thoughtful. "I know how her voice sounds when she's happy. I know how her hand feels when she touches my face. I know how she moves when she's excited. But I've always wondered what happiness looks like on her face." The studio had fallen into a profound silence. Not the typical quiet of a game show pause, but something deeper, the silence of people suddenly confronted with a perspective they had never considered. Steve had looked at Maria Santos, who was standing at the family podium with tears streaming down her face, and then back at Maria with an expression that mixed wonder with deep emotion. "Maria," Steve had said, his voice different now, stripped of all performance, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Maria had replied, her attention focused completely on his voice. "You've never seen anything, ever?" Steve had asked, approaching the question with the kind of careful respect that comes from wanting to understand without causing pain. "Nothing," Maria had confirmed matter-of-factly. "I was born this way. I've never seen colors, never seen faces, never seen what the world looks like, but I've always been curious about the visual things that make other people happy." Steve had looked around the studio, taking in the bright lights, the colorful set, the visual spectacle that was Family Feud, and trying to imagine experiencing it all through sound and intuition alone. "But you seem to see everything that matters," Steve had observed. "You know when people are happy, when they're nervous, when they're excited. How do you do that?" Maria had smiled, and the expression had transformed her entire face with a radiance that was unmistakable to everyone watching. "I listen with more than my ears," Maria had explained. "I can hear truth in people's voices. I can feel emotions in the way they move, the way they breathe. When you can't see the outside of people, you get really good at seeing the inside." Steve had paused, clearly moved by Maria's insight. "Can you tell me what you've figured out about me just from listening?" Steve had asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Maria had considered for a moment, her head tilted in concentration. "You care about people more than you care about being funny," Maria had said thoughtfully. "Your voice changes when you meet someone who's struggling. You try to make everyone feel important, but you worry about whether you're doing enough. And right now you're thinking about how to help me feel seen even though I can't see." The accuracy of Maria's assessment had left Steve momentarily speechless. The studio audience had been equally stunned by this young woman's ability to perceive character and emotion with such precision. "Maria," Steve had said, his voice thick with emotion, "you do see. You see better than most people who have working eyes. You see what matters." Steve had made a decision then that surprised everyone, including himself. He had stepped closer to Maria and gently taken her hands. "Would it be okay if I tried to see the way you see for a moment?" Steve had asked. Maria had nodded, intrigued by his request. Steve had closed his eyes tightly and stood quietly for several seconds, trying to experience the studio environment through sound and sensation rather than sight. The audience had watched in fascination as Steve Harvey, master of visual performance, attempted to navigate Maria's sensory world. "It's incredible," Steve had said, his eyes still closed. "I can hear so much more when I'm not looking. I can hear people's breathing, the way fabric rustles when someone moves, the different qualities of silence." When Steve had opened his eyes, he had looked at Maria with a new kind of respect. "You're not missing anything," Steve had told her with conviction. You're experiencing everything differently, but you're not missing what matters. You know your family loves you. You know when people are being genuine. You know how to find joy. That's better than seeing. Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping. Maria, Steve had said, I want you to have this jacket, not because I feel sorry for you, but because you've just taught me something profound about what it means to really see people. As Steve had placed the jacket around Maria's shoulders, he had continued speaking. This jacket has been with me through every show, but it's never been worn by someone who sees as clearly as you do. I want you to remember that you don't need eyes to see what's beautiful, what's true, what's important. Maria had touched the jacket with wonder, feeling the fabric and weight of it as a symbol of recognition and respect. Thank you, Maria had said softly, but can I tell you something? I don't think I'm missing out. I think I'm just experiencing the world in a different language. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve had announced, Maria Santos has just reminded us that sight isn't about eyes, it's about perception, understanding, and the ability to recognize what's truly valuable. She sees more clearly than most of us ever will. The game had resumed, but it had been transformed. Maria had answered 2 more questions, and both times her responses had demonstrated the kind of insight that comes from experiencing life through heightened senses and emotional awareness. When Steve had asked about things that bring families together, Maria had said, voices that sound like home. When he had asked about things that make you feel beautiful, Maria had replied, knowing that someone loves you exactly as you are. The episode had ended with Maria wearing Steve's jacket, her family gathered around her with obvious pride and love, and the studio audience giving her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the cameras stopped rolling, Maria had spent time with Steve and the production team, sharing more about her experience of the world and the advantages that came with her unique perspective. She had talked about how blindness had forced her to develop other senses more fully, how it had taught her to value relationships over appearances, how it had given her a kind of emotional sight that many people never develop. Carmen Santos had finally gotten to describe her own face to Maria in detail, with Steve helping to translate visual concepts into tactile and emotional terms. The conversation had been beautiful and intimate, allowing Maria to understand her mother's appearance through touch and detailed description. The episode aired 2 months later and became one of the most meaningful and widely discussed Family Feud episodes in the show's history. Viewers had been moved not by sympathy for Maria's blindness, but by admiration for her insight and by the reminder that sight comes in many forms. Organizations supporting the blind community had praised the episode for its respectful and empowering representation of visual impairment. Schools had used Maria's story to teach students about different abilities and the value of perceiving the world through various senses. Maria had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when her way of seeing had been recognized and celebrated rather than pitied. She had continued to live according to her own wisdom, using her heightened awareness to help others understand that limitations often reveal hidden strengths. Steve Harvey had learned something profound about the nature of sight and perception. Maria had taught him that the most important things in life, love, character, truth, beauty, can't be seen with eyes anyway. They have to be perceived with the heart, felt with intuition, and recognized through the kind of deep listening that Maria had mastered. The jacket that Steve had given Maria became a treasured possession, but its real value was in representing the moment when different didn't mean deficient, when blindness revealed a different kind of sight, when a 16-year-old girl reminded an entire television audience that the most beautiful things in life are invisible to the eye and must be seen with the heart. Because that's what true sight looks like when it comes from the soul. That's what wisdom sounds like when it speaks from experience rather than assumption. And that's what happens when someone who has never seen light teaches others how to recognize the illumination that comes from within.